Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. So as you get started, just a reminder, you'll have 15 minutes for your presentation, followed by 10 minutes for questions. So please get started when you're ready.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Teal Phelps-Bondroff. As my colleague from Victoria mentioned, I'm a councillor in the district of Saanich. So you're getting your municipal local government snippet here this afternoon. My background is I have a PhD in politics and international studies and BAs in political science and international relations. And I've been involved in Canadian politics for 20 years. I've actually run at every single level except for school boards. So I ran federally in Calgary West in 2006 and 2008, provincially in Calgary Bow in 2008, and municipally here in Saanich in 2018 to 2022. And I did a couple of stints doing student politics. So I have lots of different perspectives, and I wanted to offer a bit of compare and contrast with my experiences being involved in those elections at every level. Also, incidentally, for full disclosure, I did volunteer on the 2018 electoral reform referendum here in BC and in the UK when I was doing my PhD in 2011. So I've got experience knocking on probably 70,000 doors in two provinces and two countries. And today I wanted to talk about how our electoral system shapes political discourse. And I'll be looking at three areas: during elections, in government, and how citizens relate to their government. And then a little bit of content around the process for change. So how do we change our electoral system? But ultimately, I want to start with a bit of a story. This is quite fresh. I'm involved in politics at all levels, as I mentioned, and I was recently involved in the last federal election that we just wrapped up. I knocked on around 600 doors in 2 local ridings. And one thing that shocked me was only 2 people asked me what my party's platform was. Out of 600 doors, no one cared. The conversations were fixated on who was going to get first past that post and win. We weren't talking about policy. We weren't talking about values. We weren't talking about experience. We were talking about people's fears and trying to keep someone out of government rather than voting for something they believed in. And there were some really frustrating conversations. There's people who are afraid of, particularly in this case, locally in Victoria, conservative government. And so that's what we were talking about. We weren't talking about values. We weren't talking about people's experiences or policies. And this was shaped directly by our electoral system. And so during elections, I'll talk a bit about how it works in Saanich. You already heard how it works in Victoria. It's very similar. Members of the public can vote for up to 8 councillors and 1 mayor, and councillors are elected at large. It is first past the post in that respect, but you are able to vote for 8 people. And it's really interesting how this fundamentally changes how voters and candidates talk on the doorstep. I just want to build on what my colleague was saying a little bit earlier, but effectively, the conversations are about how do you build an effective team to manage a city. And I've actually seen people who are asking you the direct question on the doorstep: do you work well with others? And who would you like to work with on council? So they're very direct questions. And effectively, I think people are kind of like building a fantasy sports league. Like, we want someone with experience from education, someone who's got experience working in planning. And you effectively build a team that can manage your city. And this is really effective. The discourse is about values. It's about experience. It's about vision and policy. Less about policy because obviously you need 4 other colleagues to get anything done on council. So it really is about your values. And people are basically setting up a little team. And what's fascinating about that is the people I work best with on our council are people who are furthest from me on the political spectrum, because we can get together and work on issues that we care about. In this case, often it's housing or the environment or transportation. And those issues transcend the political spectrum. I would contrast that with provincial and federal politics, which are often typified by aggressive, vitriolic attack ads, fear-mongering, and sloganeering. When people are polled, they consistently say that they hate attack ads. And yet, why do parties use them? Because they work. Exactly. Spot on, right? You're voting against someone rather than voting for something. I don't know if some of you remember, my favorite, and I use this in heavy air quotes, attack ad in Canada was the 2006 Conservative attack ad against Paul Martin. And it was the "they'll go negative," right? Here's an attack ad criticizing another party for potentially running negative attack ads. It was the most negative, multi-layered negative campaign you've ever seen. And it was up there with Daisy and the Jesse Helms hands ad. But effectively, why this happens is it's part of the first past the post system. It encourages big tent parties and 2-party systems. And these parties tend to group left and right in the center. And one of the biggest challenges you get is parties field mostly the most broadly acceptable candidates in order to appeal to the most voters possible. And as a result, you actually have lots of demographics excluded. This excludes folks of visible minorities and women and marginalized people, and it leads to less diverse legislatures and less diverse decision making. And there's challenges faced by third parties. There's two major challenges. One is they may have broad support, but it's distributed. So there may be thousands of people who believe in voting for the Animal Party, like in the Netherlands, but they don't live in one spot, and as a result, that party will never win. And so people who perhaps share their values won't vote for them because they have no chance of winning, and so they vote for their least objectionable party or for whoever they can put up with. And that leads to a lot of alienated voters. And they're electing people who don't reflect their values but are like marginally acceptable, like the shrug emoji of voting, rather than voting for something you actually believe in. And as a result, these minority views are not reflected in legislatures. But not only that, they're not reflected in the Big Tens because those voices are still overweighed in the Big Ten parties, and as a result, they're completely marginalized. The alternative is that you have a concentrated support in a regional area, and this leads to regional fiefdoms, which include minority voices in those areas, and they create grievance politics and regionalism. And I got my start in Alberta politics. I can tell you something about regionalism and grievance politics. And this is a system where the political system is a battleground defined on where you are, rather than what you believe in. And this becomes very tribal, very nasty politics. It's divisive, it's attack-based, and a lot of voices in this process are ignored. And when voters vote for the least objectionable party or against a party, parties pander to a wide base of possible options. A lot of ideas are lost in this conversation. The discourse suffers. We get these elections that are fought around one or two issues, and you as decision makers don't get the wealth of ideas and perspectives to know what's actually going on out there. And politics becomes deeply tribal, and we can look at the fascist MAGA cult that's emerging in the United States, which is fundamentally showing how vicious tribal politics can get. Now, once you're in government, the electoral system also shapes the discourse and how it takes place in government. The animus and the conflict that arises in these first-past-the-post elections carries its way on into our legislative assemblies. So, fueled by the electoral system, you have conflict and division, false majorities, and these widely swinging pendulums where governments work to spend time and money undoing the work of the previous government. And you basically slide back and forth, and politics becomes more of a conversation around scoring points rather than passing policies that effectively benefit our communities. Other parties are vilified and denigrated, or in the United States, dehumanized. And this leads to toxic politics and lawfare. And it's so much easier to slag off an opponent or to sling mud rather than encourage collaborative decision-making and discussion and work. Under a proportional representation system, you still have rigorous debate on policy and you still have contrasting values, but the discourse shifts. Just like in the municipal system, you have to work with these people. You have to be more collegiate. You have to be more amicable, more collaborative, and it's more focused around coalition building because you have more perspectives at the table. You can't build a coalition on vitriol. You can't foster collaborative relations using caustic attack ads. So in this way, our electoral system fundamentally shapes how we talk about politics both during elections and in our legislative assemblies. When you increase representation from people from marginalized communities, minority viewpoints, or people who are geographically dispersed, you improve the decisions that we make. We all know that more diverse boards make better decisions, and the same thing holds true for legislative assemblies. But these changes in the electoral system also shape how people engage with government. At the local government, we were talking earlier, my colleague was talking earlier about how people trust local governments, but they are trusting them less and less. We're seeing an erosion in trust. And while there's many factors explaining this, our electoral system is one of the explanations. False majorities created by first-past-the-post lead to governments with a plurality rather than a majority and lots of perspectives left behind. An absence of third parties leads to a situation where people who maybe voted against a less objectionable party or more objectionable party still don't see their views reflected in the legislature, so they continue to be alienated and to have their views not heard. And one of the things I was just reflecting on last night in preparation here is the way that people criticize the government changes. So under the current model, the opposition is encouraged to contrast and to oppose the government. And this is important. But the challenge is when it's done in an excessive vitriolic way, this combative nature shifts criticism from the policies of the government to government itself. And so what you see is people aren't just critiquing policy, they're critiquing government. And this undermines people's trust in the concept of government, in the institution of government. And as a result, you see less trust. Okay, so, there's also more options for voters as well, right? This is another thing that's great about local government. If you are a resident in Saanich and you want to talk to someone who really cares about road safety, you're coming to me. especially noise pollution. I get all the noise pollution emails, right? If you want to talk about business development, one of my colleagues who has a longer track record and experience in that area, you're going to want to talk to him. Similarly, if you want to talk to someone about older adults, we've got a couple of folks on council who literally wrote our policy on that. And so residents can reach out to someone they feel most comfortable with, someone they feel can most champion their views. And this is something that you get when you have multi-member ridings, which can be promoted through PR. And this strengthens the relationship that voters have with their government. It makes them feel heard. It also makes sure that they can find the right champion in the Legislative Assembly to help champion the views that they have. And as a result, you have a greater connection. And the nature of our electoral system shifts this. If you have one MLA who is from a party who you do not support and you don't feel will listen to you effectively, then what do you do as a resident, particularly if you're in a very large riding? I'm thinking of some of our large rural northern ridings. You're going to have to drive 1,000 kilometers to do coffee with an MLA in Vancouver just to have someone who cares about the same issue as you. That might be a bit of a problem. So the current system fosters animus, conflict, and discord, and it leads to alienated voters who have loathsome options at the polls. People vote against rather than for, and this entire system is fueled on conflict, and the electoral system itself shapes that. And so I think we've already heard this, actually my colleague mentioned it from Victoria mentioned this already, but in these particularly challenging times, we desperately need collaboration, constructive and productive dialogues, rather than this conflict that we're seeing. So how do we change the system? So there's a couple aspects here. The first thing, you all know we've had multiple referenda here in British Columbia, and I wanted to share a bit of my experience from working on both one of the most recent referendums here in British Columbia and in the UK. And one of the challenges you get is asymmetric roles of the actors involved. The burden on the Yes campaign, the campaign proposing or supporting a change in electoral system, is twofold. They must educate people about how the new system works and persuade people to support that system. Whereas the No campaign has the advantage of a long-established status quo with which people are familiar, and they can muddy the waters with disinformation and misinformation. They have no incentive to explain the proposed system in a clear or compelling way. My experience in the UK was very much like this. We had this leaflet that went around, and it was trying to explain how the new electoral system was. It was an AV ranked ballot system. And this is from the No campaign. I have 3 degrees in political science, and I couldn't understand the centerfold. It opened up. It was this huge ballot with complicated diagrams, and that was the intent. It was a masterclass in muddying the waters simply by the way the information was presented. So the Yes campaigns always have an uphill battle, and that's a huge challenge. And there's better ways of consulting citizens. As my colleague just mentioned, I was reading just before I came here, we had a citizens' assembly here in Saanich and Victoria around amalgamation. 48 residents spending 8 weekends together exploring an issue in depth. That's the kind of rich discussion we need to inform an electoral system rather than a single moment, a referendum, a single moment in time. These decisions take time, study, and discussion, and things like citizens' assemblies are a fantastic way of doing that. It also avoids the echo chambers and slogan-based communications in favor of rich, meaningful conversations. One of the things I like to see, perhaps, is a check-in referendum. So you adopt an electoral reform change, and then 2 elections later, once folks have had a chance to experiment with both types, you do another referendum that says, hey, which system did you prefer? You've had first past the post, you've had PR, which one do you like? That gives people that direct experience with the electoral system, and then you can check in with them. And finally, there's lots of precedents for this, right? Like we've changed electoral systems in the past without having to go to a referendum. For example, we expanded the franchise to include a wide range of people, and we did that without a referendum. Similarly, electoral finance reform, these are all adequate options. The electoral mandate that you all have as MLAs is sufficient to inform our electoral system. So in closing, I hope this committee will recommend changes to our electoral system. My preference would be to establish a citizens' assembly to select the best form of proportional representation, and that this is then adopted for at least 2 elections, after which, if folks wanted, we could have a referendum based on evaluating the 2 different systems and selecting which one we preferred. And ultimately, we need a voting system that fundamentally changes how our discourse takes place. Our current system is one that's set up around hostility and conflict, and I think we need an electoral system that favors collaboration and constructive dialogue. And electoral reform leading to systems like proportional representation is a much better system, and one where we can all collaborate together on improving the province that we all love. Thank you.